Here's a segment from a recent Gun Talk radio episode. You can listen to all the Gun Talk radio podcasts however you tune in, or check out guntalk.com for more. Joining me right now is Professor of Law at UCLA, Eugene Volokh joins us. Thank you so much for being here, Eugene.
Always a great pleasure.
So let me ask you this. You have written extensively on the First Amendment and on the Second Amendment. In what ways are they similar? What ways are they different?
Well, they're similar in that they secure an individual right to do something, whether to speak or petition or assemble or to keep and bear arms. They're also similar in that the courts have never viewed them as absolute categorical protections. There are exceptions to First Amendment protection. There are exceptions to Second Amendment protection. They are potentially different in that some of the assumptions that are pretty broadly held about their scope really do differ. I'll give you an example, and maybe we're wrong in seeing this difference, but I think most of us would say, a typical 12-year-old shouldn't have the right to carry a gun to school.
Okay.
At the same time, the Supreme Court has said that a typical 12-year-old does have a First Amendment right to speak in school.
Uh-huh.
Not unlimited, obviously not to interrupt class, not in a way that causes substantial disruption, actually not even a way that's vulgar, even though vulgarities among adults are generally protected. But if he wants to wear an armband to school to protest the Vietnam War, that was the famous Tinker versus Des Moines Board of Education case from 1969, well, then he has a First Amendment right to do that. I don't think we'd say that about the Second Amendment. I think a lot of people agree that people with at least violent felony convictions shouldn't have the right to have guns. Right now, the Supreme Court has even said that people with any felony convictions presumptively don't have the right to have guns. Maybe it went too far in that, but I think most people would say, look, if you commit armed robbery with a gun, and then you are let out of prison because usually you're not in jail for life or something like that, you still shouldn't be able to have a gun. But at the same time, presumably, you have full First Amendment rights to speak. In fact, the Supreme Court, in a case a few years ago called Packingham v. North Carolina, struck down a state statute that limited the rights of people with sex offenses on their record from participating on social media. So I don't think we'd say that they're identical, in part because, I support the right to bear arms, but you got to acknowledge that guns are immediately deadly in a way that speech is not. Speech can be deadly. In fact, throughout the world, there have been tens of millions in the last century, tens of millions of deaths from political oppression of various sorts, whether communist or Nazi or some such. And, at the heart of those regimes at some point was speech that helped bring them to power. So speech can be deadly in that way, but it's not deadly in the immediate way that, in fact, we think that possession of guns by 12-year-olds might be.
Okay.
So I think it's important to consider the similarities between the two. I've argued that courts should look to law from one area and another, and in fact courts have been in some measure doing that. But at the same time, I don't think we can just categorically say they're identical.
Now, obviously, jurisprudence on the Second Amendment has been changing and interesting, and following Heller and whether either has or has not happened as a result of that. What's your take on kind of where we are just generally with legal cases and scholarship on the Second Amendment?
Well, it looks fairly likely from all we hear that basically the whole country will go more or less shall issue as a result of Bruin. It looks like the Supreme Court will say that the right to keep and bear arms includes the right to carry guns in most public places, not all public places, but in most public places. For most people, again, not all people, not perhaps felons, not children, but for most people. I think the court might say, because of the history of regulating concealed carry in the 1800s, even banning concealed carry in many states, a state merely has to allow people to carry somehow, whether open or concealed. But my guess is most of the remaining non-shall-issue states, like my own California, will say, look, if we were required to let people carry guns either openly or concealed, we'd much rather they carry them concealed. So I think what will happen is that citizens of California, of New York, of Massachusetts, a few other states will now, for the first time, be able to carry guns, likely concealed, with some licensing requirements. Probably, I don't think they're going to go full on, no license needed, constitutional carry. And I think that'll be a big step forward. I suspect the court isn't going to go much beyond that, so it won't, for example, resolve questions like, can a state ban people from carrying in places that sell alcohol? A considerable number of states, including I think some that are generally pro-gun, say, well, you can't carry in places that sell alcohol. And then it's an interesting question. Well, if that's so, how broadly does the exception run? Like a lot of people might say, well, we don't really want people carrying in places where people are drinking, especially bars. Mm-hmm. So I think even, again, a lot of gun rights supporters would say, I'm all in favor of people carrying guns, but I prefer sober people carrying guns. And the guns and alcohol, they might think are a bad combination. Well, but some of the laws that I've seen are broad enough to carry any place where they're sold, even like a supermarket. So somebody who's going to a market and wants to carry, usually, not so much they're worried about carrying in the market, but they're afraid on their way to and from their market or to and from their car, they might need a gun. Would they be not allowed to do that? So there are going to be interesting questions. Another question, which, as you know, is very much in the news now, is what do you do about 18 to 20-year-olds?
Right.
Generally speaking, constitutional rights that people enjoy, they enjoy starting with 18 and sometimes even before 18, as we see with free speech in considerable measure. Mm-hmm. And 18 to 20-year-olds are generally speaking have the same constitutional rights, not all the same rights. Like, for example, they may not have the right to drink to drink alcohol, but of course there is no constitutional right to drink alcohol. It's quite common for the Supreme Court in resolving an issue to set forth some basic principle, like there is generally speaking a right to own handguns. That's Heller. Right. There is generally speaking a right to carry them in public places, subject to various regulations. That may very well be the conclusion in Bruin. But the court often says that, but doesn't then lay out a detailed code as to what's allowed and what's not allowed.
So you don't foresee a change or maybe some type of direction in terms of a higher level of scrutiny for Second Amendment?
Right. Well, so this whole level of scrutiny issue is pretty complicated. So, as many of your listeners may know, courts talk about things like strict scrutiny, which is generally suggests that some right, even though it's not absolute, is very hard to restrict. Mm-hmm. And then there's intermediate scrutiny, which seems to suggest that courts can sort of balance on a case-by-case basis the government interests and the scope of the right and uphold some restrictions and strike down others. And lower courts have talked a lot about whether there should be intermediate scrutiny for some gun restrictions, strict scrutiny for others. Some justices in the Supreme Court have said, we don't like this whole standards of scrutiny thing. That's just sort of a recipe for judges to just make it up as they go along. And I sympathize a lot with that criticism. I think it may be that this whole standards of scrutiny discussion as to free speech as well as to the right to bear arms is something of a mistake. I just doubt that that there are going to be 5 justices who are going to be willing to resolve that issue. The New York law is very close to a total ban on concealed carry. It's not exactly that, but because under New York law, ordinary people by definition can't have guns because you have to show that you're extraordinary. There's something very unusual about your situation. Right. In order, you shouldn't have guns, but can't have guns, but can't carry guns. You need to show something extraordinary about your situation to get a carry permit. So I think that there will be a majority of at least 5 justices who say, look, that can't be constitutional. But I doubt there will be a majority of 5 justices who will be willing to say, and the right standard is for other things is strict scrutiny, for something that's intermediate scrutiny, or we're going to reject that altogether. I think it'll be easy for them to say this is something that can't pass muster at all because it's basically a total ban. As to other more modest restrictions, we'll resolve them when we get them.
There you go. All right, so tell people about the Volokh Conspiracy. Where can they find it? What are you guys doing over there? Because I'm there every day. I love what you guys are doing.
Well, thank you so much. So for the last 20 years, literally it's been a little over 20 years, some friends of mine, basically, they're almost all law professors, and I have been publishing this blog. It was originally just solo, then, just independent. Then we were actually at the Washington Post site for several years. And now more recently, we're at the Reason magazine website. So if you go to reason.com/Volokh, Volokh, you'll find it. It's called the Volokh Conspiracy. It's a little joke, like,
right.
Here we are. We call ourselves a conspiracy, and we've got a website that calls that. So, or if you don't remember the Reason stuff, just search for my name, Volokh, and you're the first thing you'll see is the blog.
Eugene Volokh, thank you so much for what you do and for, frankly, making a lot of things clear for those of us who are not experts in this as you are.
Well, very much my pleasure. My goal is to make clear some things that are otherwise unclear, and sometimes to make unclear things that people think are clear, but turns out are not.
Well, mission accomplished.
All right.
All right, good stuff.